Section 34 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in August 2022. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 10, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Earliest positive discovery of Australia, A.D. 1606, by Louis Beck and Walter Jeffery. As shown by the authors of the following account, there is no lack of evidence that it was belief in a great southern land which led early geographers and sailors to believe in the existence of the Australian continent. Notwithstanding this, it is held by some students of the subject to be doubtful whether the first navigators who reached the shores of Australia set out with any expectation of discovering a great land in the south. Whether this was the case or not, it is argued that the earliest achievements in that quarter were either of no definite consequence or were imperfectly estimated by those who made or promoted the discoveries in connection with which not even their names have been preserved. The narrative of Beck and Jeffery, with its references to other leading authorities, furnishes the completest and most recent information on this subject available within the compass of a reasonably brief survey. Learned geographers have gone back to very remote times, even to the Middle Ages, and, by the aid of old maps, have set up ingenious theories showing that the Australian continent was then known to explorers. Some evidence has been adduced of a French voyage in which the continent was discovered in the youth of the 16th century, and of course it has been asserted that the Chinese were acquainted with the land long before Europeans ventured to go so far afloat. There is strong evidence that the west coast of Australia was touched by the Spanish and the Portuguese during the first half of the 16th century, and proof of its discovery early in the 17th century. At the time of these very early South Sea voyages, the search, it should always be remembered, was for a great Antarctic continent. The discovery of islands in the Pacific was, to the explorers, a matter of minor importance. New Guinea, although visited by the Portuguese in 1526, up to the time of Captain Cook was supposed by Englishmen to be a part of the mainland, and the eastern coast of Australia, though touched upon earlier and roughly outlined upon maps, remained unknown to them until Cook explored it. Early Voyages to Australia by R. H. Major, printed by the Hucklout Society in 1859, is still the best collection of facts, and contains the soundest deductions from them on the subject, and although ably written books have since been published, the industrious authors have added little or nothing in the way of indisputable evidence to that collected by Major. The belief in the existence of the Australian continent grew gradually and naturally out of a belief in a great southern land. G. B. Barton, in an introduction to his valuable Australian history, traces this from 1578, when Frobisher wrote, "Terra Australis seemeth to be a great, firm land, lying under and about the South Pole, being in many places a fruitful soil, and is not yet thoroughly discovered, but only seen and touched on the north edge thereof by the travel of the Portugales and Spaniards in their voyages to their East and West Indies. It is included almost by a parallel, passing at 40 degrees in south latitude, yet in some places it reacheth into the sea with great promontories, even to the tropic Capricornus. Only these parts are best known, as over against Capo Buena Speranza, where the Portugales see popinjays commonly of a wonderful greatness, and again it is known at the south side of the Strait of Magallanes, and is called Terra del Fuego. It is thought this south land about the pole Antarctic is far bigger than the north land about the pole Arctic, but whether it be so or not, we have no certain knowledge, for we have no particular description thereof, as we have of the land under and about the North Pole. Then Purchas, in 1578, says, This land about the straits is not perfectly discovered, whether it be continent or islands. Some take it for continent, and extend it more in their imagination than any man's experience toward those islands of Solomon and New Guinea, esteeming, of which there is great probability, that Terra Australis, or the southern continent, may for the largeness thereof take a first place in order, and the first in greatness in the division and parting of the whole world. The most important of the Spanish voyages was that made by the Quiros, who left Callao in December 1605, in charge of an expedition of 3 ships. One of these vessels was commanded by Luis Vaez de Torres. The Quiros, who is believed to have been by birth a Portuguese, discovered several island groups and many isolated islands, among the former being the New Hebrides, which he, believing he had found the continent, named Tierra Australis del Espiritu Santo. Soon after, the ships commanded by the Quiros became separated from the other vessels, and Torres took charge. He subsequently found that the land seen was an island group, and so determined to sail westward, in pursuance of the scheme of exploration. In about the month of August he fell in with a chain of islands, now called the Louisiade Archipelago and included in the British possession of New Guinea, which he thought, reasonably enough, was the beginning of New Guinea, but which really lies a little to the southeast of that great island. As he could not weather the group, he bore away to the southward, and his subsequent proceedings are here quoted from Burney's Voyages. We went along 300 leagues of coast, as I have mentioned, and diminished the latitude 2½ degrees, which brought us into 9 degrees. From thence we fell in with a bank of from 3 to 9 fathoms, which extends along the coast to 7½ south latitude, and the end of it is in 5 degrees. We could go no further on for the many shoals and great currents, so we were obliged to sail southwest in that depth to 11 degrees south latitude. There is all over it an archipelago of islands, without number, by which we passed, and at the end of the 11th degree the bank became shoulder. Here were very large islands, and they appeared more to the southward. They were inhabited by black people, very corpulent and naked. Their arms were lances, arrows, and clubs of stone ill-fashioned. We could not get any of their arms. We caught in all this land 20 persons of different nations, that with them we might be able to give a better account to your Majesty. They give us much notice of other people, although as yet they do not make themselves well understood. We were upon this bank 2 months, at the end of which time we found ourselves in 25 fathoms and 5 degrees south latitude, and 10 leagues from the coast, and having gone 480 leagues here, the coast goes to the northeast. I did not search it, for the bank became very shallow. So we stood to the north. The very large islands seen by Torres were, no doubt, the hills of Cape York, the northernmost point of Australia, and so he, all unconsciously, had passed within sight of the continent for which he was searching. A copy of the report by Torres was lodged in the archives of Manila, and when the English took that city in 1762, Dalrymple, the celebrated geographer, discovered it and gave the name of Torres Straits to what is now well known as the dangerous passage dividing New Guinea from Australia. The Quiros, in his ship, made no further discovery. He arrived on the Mexican coast in October 1606, and did all he could to induce Philip III of Spain to sanction further exploration, but without success. Of the voyages of the Dutch in Australian waters, much interesting matter is available. Major sums up the case in these words: "The entire period up to the time of Dampier, ranging over 2 centuries, presents these 2 phases of obscurity, that in the 16th century, the period of the Portuguese and Spanish discoveries, there are indications on maps of the great probability of Australia having already been discovered, but with no written documents to confirm them, while in the 17th century there is documentary evidence that its coasts were touched upon or explored by a considerable number of Dutch voyagers, but the documents immediately describing these voyages have not been found. The period of known Dutch discovery begins with the establishment of the Dutch East India Company, and a knowledge of the west coast of Australia grew within the growth of the Dutch colonies, but grew slowly, for the Dutchmen were too busy trading to risk ships and spend time and money upon scientific voyages. In January 1644, Commodore Abel Janszoon Tasman was dispatched upon his second voyage of discovery to the South Seas, and his instructions, signed by the Governor-General of Batavia, Antonio van Diemen, begin with a recital of all previous Dutch voyages of a similar character. From this document, an interesting summary of Dutch exploration can be made. Tasman, in his first voyage, had discovered the island of Van Diemen, which he named after the then governor of Batavia, but which has since been named Tasmania, after its discoverer. During this first voyage, the navigator also discovered New Zealand, passed round the east side of Australia without seeing the land, and on his way home sailed along the northern shore of New Guinea. But to come back to the summary of Dutch voyages found in Tasman's instructions. During 1605 and 1606, the Dutch yacht Duiven made 2 exploring voyages to New Guinea. On one trip, the commander, after coasting New Guinea, steered southward along the islands on the west side of Torres Straits to that part of Australia, a little to the west and south of Cape York, marked on modern maps as Duiven Point, thus, unconsciously, for he thought himself still on the west coast of New Guinea, marking the first authenticated discovery of the continent. Dirk Hartog, in command of the Eendracht, while on his way from Holland to the East Indies, put into what Dampier afterward called Shark's Bay, and on an island, which now bears his name, deposited a tin plate with an inscription recording his arrival, and dated October 25, 1616. The plate was afterward found by a Dutch navigator in 1697 and replaced by another, which, in its turn, was discovered in July 1801 by Captain Hamelin of the Naturaliste on the well-known French voyage in search of the ill-fated La Pérouse. The Frenchman copied the inscription and nailed the plate to a post, with another recording his own voyage. These inscriptions were a few years later removed by de Freycinet and deposited in the Museum of the Institute of Paris. Hartog ran along the coast a few degrees, naming the land after his ship, and was followed by many other voyagers at frequent intervals down to the year 1727, from which time Dutch exploration has no more a place in Australian discovery. During the 122 years of which we have records of their voyages, although the Dutch navigator's work, compared with that done by Cook and his successors, was of small account, yet, considering the state of nautical science, and that the ships were for the most part Dutch East India men, the Dutch names which still sprinkle the north and the west coasts of the continent show that from Cape York in the extreme north, westward of the Great Australian Bight in the south, the Dutchmen had touched at intervals the whole coastline. But before leaving the Dutch period, there are 1 or 2 voyages that, either on account of their interesting or important character, deserve brief mention. In 1823, Arnham's Land, now the northern district of the Northern Territory of South Australia, was discovered by the Dutch yachts Pesa and Arnhem. This voyage is also noteworthy on account of the massacre of the master of the Arnhem and 8 of his crew by the natives while they were exploring the coast of New Guinea. In 1627, the first discovery of the south coast was made by the Gull de Zeepart, and the land then explored, extending from Cape Leeuwin to the Nuits Archipelago on the South Australian coast, was named after Peter Nuits, then on board the ship on his way to Batavia, whence he was sent to Japan as ambassador from Holland. In the year 1628, a colonizing expedition of 11 vessels left Holland for the Dutch East Indies. Among these ships was the Batavia, commanded by Francis Pelsart. A terrible storm destroyed 10 of the fleet, and on June 4, 1629, the Batavia was driven ashore on the reef still known as Houtman's Abrolhos, which has been discovered and named by a Dutch East Indiaman some years earlier, probably by the commander of the Leeuwin, who discovered and named after his ship the cape at the southwest point of the continent. The Batavia, which carried a number of chests of silver money, went to pieces on the reef. The crew of the ship managed to land upon the rocks and saved some food from the wreck, but they were without water. Pelsart, in one of the ship's boats, spent a couple of weeks in exploring the inhospitable coast in the neighborhood, in the hope of discovering water, but found so little that he ultimately determined to attempt to make Batavia and from there bring succor to his ship's company. On July 3rd, he fell in with a Dutch ship of Java and was taken on to Batavia. From there he obtained help and returned to the wreck, arriving at the Abrolhos in the middle of September. But during the absence of the commander, the castaways had gone through a terrible experience, which is related in Thérineau's Recueil de Voyages Curieux, and translated into English in Major's book, from which the following is extracted. While Pelsart is soliciting assistance, I will return to those of the crew who remained on the island, but I should first inform you that the supercargo, named Jerome Cornelis, formerly an apothecary at Haarlem, had conspired with the pilot and some others, when off the coast of Africa, to obtain possession of the ship and take her to Dunkirk, or to avail themselves of her for the purpose of piracy. This supercargo remained upon the wreck 10 days after the vessel had struck, having discovered no means of reaching the shore. He even passed 2 days upon the mainmast, which floated, and, having from thence got upon a yard, at length gained the land. In the absence of Pelsart, he became commander, and deemed this a suitable occasion for putting his original design into execution, concluding that it would not be difficult to become master of that which remained of the wreck, and to surprise Pelsart when he should arrive with the assistance, which he had gone to Batavia to seek, and afterwards to cruise in these seas with his vessel. To accomplish this, it was necessary to get rid of those of the crew who were not of his party, but before imbruing his hands with blood, he caused his accomplices to sign a species of compact, by which they promised fidelity one to another. The entire crew was divided, living between 3 islands. Upon that of Cornelis, which they had named the graveyard of Batavia, was the greatest number of men. One of them, by name Weybehays, a lieutenant, had been dispatched to another island to seek for water, and having discovered some after a search of 20 days, he made the preconcerted signal by lighting 3 fires, but in vain, for they were not noticed by the people of Cornelis' company, the conspirators having during that time murdered those who were not of their party. Of these they killed 30 or 40. Some few saved themselves upon pieces of wood, which they joined together, and, going in search of Weybehays, informed him of the horrible massacre that had taken place. Having with him 45 men, he resolved to keep upon his guard, and to defend himself from their assassins if they should make an attack upon his company, which in effect they designed to do, and to treat the other party in the same manner, for they feared lest their company, or that which remained upon the 3rd island, should inform the commander upon his arrival, and thus prevent the execution of their design. They succeeded easily with the party last mentioned, which was the weakest, killing the whole of them, excepting 7 children and some women. They hoped to succeed as easily with Weybehays' company, and in the meanwhile broke open the chests of merchandise which had been saved from the vessel. Jerome Cornelis caused clothing to be made for his company out of the rich stuffs which he found therein, choosing to himself a bodyguard, each of whom he clothed in scarlet, embroidered with gold and silver. Regarding the women as a part of the spoil, he took one for himself, and gave one of the daughters of the minister to a principal member of his party, abandoning the other 3 for public use. He drew up also certain rules for the future conduct of his men. After these horrible proceedings, he caused himself to be elected Captain-General by a document which he compelled all his companions to sign. He afterwards sent 22 men in 2 shallops to destroy the company of Webehay's, but they met with a repulse. Taking with him 37 men, he went himself against Webehay's, who received him at the water's edge as he disembarked, and forced him to retire, although the lieutenant and his men had no weapons but clubs, the ends of which were armed with spikes. Finding force unavailing, the mutineer had recourse to other means. He proposed a treaty of peace, the Champlain, who remained with Webehay's, drawing up the conditions. It was agreed to, with this proviso, that Webehay's company should remain unmolested, and they, upon their part, agreed to deliver up a little boat in which one of the sailors had escaped from the island where Cornelis was located to that of Webehay's, receiving in return some stuffs for clothing his people. During his negotiations, Cornelis wrote to certain French soldiers who belonged to the lieutenant's company, offering to each a sum of money to corrupt them, with the hope that with this assistance he might easily compass his design. His letters, which were without effect, were shown to Webehay's, and Cornelis, who was ignorant of their disclosure, having arrived the next day with 3 or 4 others to find Webehay's and bring him the apparel, the latter caused him to be attacked, killed 2 or 3 of the company, and took Cornelis himself prisoner. One of them, by name Wouterlos, who escaped from this rout, returned the following day to renew the attack, but with little success. Pelsart arrived during these occurrences in the frigate Sardam. As he approached the wreck, he observed smoke from a distance, a circumstance that afforded him great consolation, since he perceived by it that his people were not all dead. He cast anchor and threw himself immediately into a skiff with bread and wine, and proceeded to land on one of the islands. Nearly at the same time a boat came alongside with 4 armed men. Webehay's, who was one of the 4, informed him of the massacre, and advised him to return as speedily as possible to his vessel, for that the conspirators designed to surprise him, having already murdered 25 persons, and to attack him with 2 shallops, adding that he himself had that morning been at close quarters with them. Pelsart perceived at the time the 2 shallops coming toward him, and had scarcely got on board his vessel before they came alongside. He was surprised to see the people covered with embroidery of gold and silver, and weapons in their hands, and demanded of them why they approached the vessel armed. They replied that they would inform him when they came on board. He commanded them to cast their arms into the sea, or otherwise he would sink them. Finding themselves compelled to submit, they threw away their weapons, and, being ordered on board, were immediately placed in irons. One of them, named Jan de Bremen, confessed that he had put to death or assisted in the assassination of 27 persons. The same evening Webehay's brought his prisoner on board. On September 18th the captain and the master pilot, taking with them 10 men of Webehay's company, passed over in boats to the island of Cornelis. Those who still remained thereon lost all courage as soon as they saw them, and allowed themselves to be placed in irons. Pelsart remained another week at the Abrolhos, endeavouring to recover some of the Batavia's treasure, and succeeded in finding all but 1 chest. The mutineers were tried by the officers of the Sardam, and all but 2 were executed before the ship left the scene of their awful crime. The 2 men who were not hanged were put on shore on the mainland, and were probably the first Europeans to end their lives upon the continent. Dutch vessels for many years afterward sought for traces of the marooned seamen, but none was ever discovered. The 1644 voyage of Tasman was made expressly for the purpose of exploring the north and northwestern shores of the continent, and to prove the existence, or otherwise, of straits separating it from New Guinea. Tasman's instructions show this, and prove that while the existence of the straits was suspected, and although Torres had unconsciously passed through them, they were not known. Tasman explored a long length of coastline, establishing its continuity from the extreme northwestern point, Arnhem Land, as far as the 22nd degree of south latitude, Exmouth Gulf. He failed to prove the existence of Torres Straits, but to him, it is generally agreed, is due to discovery and naming of the Gulf of Carpentaria, Carpenter in Tasman's time being president at Amsterdam of the Dutch India Company, and the naming of a part of North Australia, as he had previously named the island to the south, after Van Diemen. From this voyage dates the name New Holland. The great stretch of coastlines embracing his discoveries became known to his countrymen as Hollandia Nova, a name which, in its English form, was adopted for the whole continent, and remained until it was succeeded by the more euphonious name of Australia. Tasman continued doing good service for the Dutch East India Company until his death, about 1659, at Batavia. End of section 34.
Section 35 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by T.R. Love of Pleasant Hill, California. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 10, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Settlement of Virginia, charter under which America was colonized, A.D. 1607, by R.R. Howison. As the first of the original English colonies in North America, Virginia enjoys a primacy in our history, which, however other sectional claims may be contested, is beyond dispute. The name Virginia, which in 1584 Sir Walter Raleigh gave to his settlement on the Carolina coast, at first covered an indefinite extent of the great central territory of the continent. After the failure and disappearance of Raleigh's colony, no further attempts were made to settle the region until 1606, when new interest in American colonization had been aroused in England. The credit for awakening this interest is given to Bartholomew Gosnold, an English navigator who in 1602 sailed directly west and in May reached Cape Cod. Then, coasting along New England, he found and named Martha's Vineyard, and in July returned to England. English adventurers were so much impressed with his enthusiastic reports and his arguments in favor of new endeavors to occupy Western lands that they began to urge a fresh undertaking. Gosnold's views were strongly supported by the geographer Richard Hakluyt, to whom America owes a heavy debt of gratitude. There were numerous offers of money and service, and when application was made to King James I, he was quite ready to sanction the project. He is said to have thought of the profits that might return to him, and also of the satisfaction to be found in being rid of the turbulent spirits sure to be drawn into the enterprise. On April 10, 1606, James I issued a patent to Sir Thomas Gates, Sir George Somers, Richard Hakluyt, and others with them associated, under which they proposed to embark upon their eagerly sought scheme. This royal grant deserves our close attention, as it will explain the nature of the enterprise and the powers originally enjoyed by those who entered upon it. Selecting for the scenes of operation the beautiful belt of country lying between the 34th and 45th parallels of north latitude, the king certainly provided an ample field for the success of the patentees. This tract extends from Cape Fear to Halifax and embraces all the lands between its boundaries in North America, except perhaps the French settlement in Arcadia, which had already been so far matured as to come under the excluding clause of the patent. For colonizing this extensive region, the king appointed 2 companies of adventurers, the first consisting of noblemen, knights, gentlemen, and others in and about the city of London, which through all its subsequent modifications was known by the title of the London Company. The other consisted of knights, gentlemen, merchants, and others in and about the town of Plymouth, and was known as the Plymouth Company, though its operations were never extensive and were at last utterly fruitless. To the London adventurers was granted exclusive right to all the territory lying between the 34th and 38th parallels, and running from the ocean to an indefinite extent westward into the wilds of America, even to the waters of the Pacific. They were also allowed all the islands, fisheries, and other marine treasures within 100 miles directly eastward from their shores, and within 50 miles from their most northern and most southern settlements, following the coast to the northeast or southwest, as might be necessary. Within these limits, ample jurisdiction is conferred upon them. To the Plymouth Company were granted in like manner the land and appurtenances between the 41st and 45th parallels. Thus, the whole region between 38 and 41 was left open to the enterprise of both companies. But to render angry collision impossible, the charter contained the judicious clause above noted, by which each colony might claim exclusive right 50 miles north or south of its extreme settlements, and thus neither would approach within 100 miles of the other. The hope of gold and silver from America was yet clinging with tenacity to the English mind. James grants to the companies unlimited right to dig and obtain the precious and other metals, but reserves to himself 1/5 of all the gold and silver and 1/15 of all the copper that might be discovered. Immediately after this clause, we find a section granting to the councils for the colonies authority to coin money and use it among the settlers and natives. This permission may excite some surprise when we remember that the right to coin has been always guarded with peculiar jealousy by English monarchs, and that this constituted one serious charge against the Massachusetts colony in the unjust proceedings by which her charter was wrested from her in subsequent years. To the companies was given power to carry settlers to Virginia and plant them upon her soil, and no restriction was annexed to this authority except that none should be taken from the realm upon whom the king should lay his injunction to remain. The colonists were permitted to have arms and to resist and repel all intruders from foreign states, and it was provided that none should trade and traffic within the colonies unless they should pay or agree to pay to the treasurers of the companies 2 1/2% on their stock in trade if they were English subjects, and 5% if they were aliens. The sums so paid were to be appropriated to the company for 21 years from the date of the patent, and afterward were transferred to the crown. James never forgot a prospect for gain, and could not permit the colonists to enjoy forever the customs which, as consumers of foreign goods, they must necessarily have paid from their resources. The jealous policy which at this time forbade the exportation without license of English products to foreign countries has left its impress upon this charter. The colonists were, indeed, allowed to import all sufficient shipping and furniture of armor, weapons, ordnance, powder, victual, and other things necessary, without burdensome restraint, but it was provided that if any goods should be shipped from England or her dependencies with pretense to carry them to Virginia, and should afterward be conveyed to foreign ports, the goods were conveyed, and the vessel containing them should be absolutely forfeited to His Majesty, his heirs, and successors. The lands held in the colonies were to be possessed by their holders under the most favorable species of tenure known to the laws of the mother country. King James had never admired the military tenure entailed upon England by the feudal system, and he had made a praiseworthy though unsuccessful effort to reduce them all to the form of free and common socage, a mode of holding land afterward carried into full effect by Charles II, and which, if less pervaded by the knightly spirit of feudal ages, was more favorable to the holder and more congenial with the freedom of the English Constitution. This easy tenure was expressly provided for the lands of the new country, and it is a happy circumstance that America has been little affected even by the softened bonds thus early imposed upon her. But how shall these colonial subjects be governed, and from whom shall they derive their laws? These were questions to which the vanity and the arbitrary principles of the king soon found a reply. 2 councils were to be provided, one for each colony, and each consisting of 13 members. They were to govern the colonists according to such laws, ordinances, and instructions as should afterward be given by the king himself, under his sign manual and the privy seal of the realm of England. And the members of the council were to be ordained, made, and removed from time to time, as the same instruction should direct. In addition to these provincial bodies, a council of 13, likewise appointed by the king, was to be created in England, to which was committed the general duty of superintending the affairs of both colonies. And to prove the pious designs of a monarch whose religion neither checked the bigotry of his spirit nor the profaneness of his language, it was recited in the preamble of this charter that one leading object of the enterprise was the propagation of Christianity among such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and might in time be brought to human civility and to a settled and quiet government. Such was the first charter of James to the colony of Virginia. We will not now pause to consider it minutely, either for praise or for blame. With some provisions that seemed to be judicious, and which afterward proved themselves to be salutary, it embraces the most destructive elements of despotism and dissension. The settlers were deprived of the meanest privilege of self-government, and were subjected to the control of a council wholly independent of their own action, and of laws proceeding directly or indirectly from the king himself. The Parliament of England would have been a much safer depository of legislative power for the colonists than the creatures of a monarch who held doctrines worthy of the Sultan of Turkey or the Tsar of the Russian Empire. But all parties seemed well satisfied with this charter, and neither the king nor the adventurers had before their minds the grand results that were now giving birth. The patentees diligently urged forward preparations for the voyage, and James employed his leisure hours in preparing the instructions and code of laws contemplated by the charter. His wondrous wisdom rejoiced in the task of acting the modern Solon, and penning statutes which were to govern the people yet unborn, and neither his advisers nor the colonists seem to have reflected upon the enormous exercise of prerogative herein displayed. The adventurers did not cease to be Englishmen in becoming settlers of a foreign clime, and the charter had expressly guaranteed to them all liberties, franchises, and immunities enjoyed by native-born subjects of the realm. Even acts of full Parliament bind not the colonies unless they be expressly included, and an English writer of subsequent times has not hesitated to pronounce this conduct of the royal lawmaker in itself illegal, November 20th. But James proceeded with much eagerness to a task grateful alike to his vanity and his principles of government. By these articles of instruction, the king first establishes the General Council to remain in England for the superintendence of the colonies. It consisted originally of 13, but was afterward increased to nearly 40, and a distinction was made in reference to the London and Plymouth companies. In this body we note many names which were afterward well known both in the interests of America and the motherland. Sir William Wade, Lieutenant of the Tower of London, Sir Thomas Smith, Sir Oliver Cromwell, Sir Herbert Croft, Sir Edwin Sandys, and others formed a power to whom were entrusted many of the rights of the intended settlement. They were authorized, at the pleasure and in the name of His Majesty, to give directions for the good government of the settlers in Virginia, and to appoint the first members of the councils to be resident in the colonies. These resident councils, thus appointed, or the major part of them, were required to choose from their own body a member, not being a minister of God's word, who was to be president, and to continue in office for a single year. They were authorized to fill vacancies in their own body, and for sufficient cause to remove the president and elect another in his stead, but the authority to increase, alter, or change these provincial councils was reserved as a final right to the king. The Church of England was at once established, and the local powers were to require that the true word and service of God, according to her teachings, should be preached, planted, and used not only among the settlers, but as far as possible among the sons of the forest. The crimes of rebellion, tumults, conspiracy, mutiny, and sedition, as well as murder, incest, rape, and adultery, were to be punished with death, without benefit of clergy. To manslaughter, clergy was allowed. These crimes were to be tried by jury, but the president and council were to preside at the trial, to pass sentence of death, to permit no reprieve without their order, and no absolute pardon without the sanction of the king, under the Great Seal of England. But with the exception of these capital felonies, the president and council were authorized to hear and determine all crimes and misdemeanors, and all civil cases without the intervention of a jury. These judicial proceedings were to be summary and verbal, and the judgment only was to be briefly registered in a book kept for the purpose. For 5 years succeeding the landing of the settlers, all the results of their labor were to be held in common, and were to be stored in suitable magazines. The president and the council were to elect a Cape merchant to superintend these public houses of deposit, and 2 clerks to note all that went into or came out from them, and every colonist was to be supplied from the magazines by the direction and appointment of these officers or of the council. The adventurers of the first colony were to choose from their number 1 or more companies, each to consist of at least 3 persons, to reside in or near London, and these were to superintend the general course of trade between the mother country and her distant daughter, and direct it into such channels as would be most advantageous to both. No person was to be admitted to reside in the colonies but such as would take oath of obedience to the king, in the ample form provided for by a statute passed early in the reign of James, and any rash offenders who should attempt to withdraw from allegiance to his majesty was to be imprisoned until Reformation, or else sent to England, there to receive condign punishment. The president and councils, or the major part of them, were empowered from time to time to make, ordain, and constitute laws, ordinances, and officers for the better government of the colony, provided that none of these laws affected life or limb in the settlers. Their enactments were also required to be, in substance, consonant to the jurisprudence of England, and the king or the council in the mother country was invested with absolute power at any time to rescind and make void the acts of the provincial councils. As the colonists should increase in population and influence, the king reserves to himself the right to legislate for them, but condescends to restrict his law-making energies to such action as might be consonant to the law of England or the equity thereof. And to show his tender feelings toward the aborigines, whose lands he was so deliberately appropriating to the use of his subjects, His Majesty requires that they shall be treated with all kindness and charity, and that all proper means should be used to bring them to the knowledge of God and the obedience of the king, his heirs, and successors, under such severe pains and punishments as should be inflicted by the respective presidents and councils of the several colonies. On these kindly ordinances, the philosophic reader will not fail to observe the impress of the man. The stern penalty of death visited the crimes of rebellion and conspiracy, which aimed a blow at sovereign power, and even the popular tumult, which kings have so much cause to dread, was stilled by the same bloody monitor. Yet arson and burglary were left to the discretion of the councils. Adultery was punished with death, a penalty never inflicted even in England, except during a time of puritanic zeal, which offered God a service without knowledge. In the eye of divine purity, the offender by this crime may be the vilest of the vile. But if the Redeemer of the world refused to denounce the punishment of death against one taken in the act, it devolved not on this Scottish Draco to render it a capital crime. The whole legislative power is vested in the council, without any reference to the interests or the rights of the people whom they work to govern, and the king retains absolute control over the present and future laws of the colony, thus rendering their great distance from his face the best protection they could have against his tyranny. The trial by jury was required for capital felonies and manslaughter, but all inferior offenses and every civil interest, however overwhelming in importance to the colonist, were to be summarily decided upon by the provincial councils. In the same space it would have been difficult to compress more absurd concession and of ruinous restraint. The clause requiring all things to be held in common was destructive of the most powerful stimulus that urges man to labor. The semblance of mercy which forbade war upon the savages often held the hand of the settler when raised in self-defense. And the church establishment, forced by the arm of the law upon reckless adventurers, made religion a hated bondage, and the tithe-gatherer more odious than the author of evil. But notwithstanding the defects and deformities of a charter which, in modern times, would have been indignantly rejected as an invasion of the rights of man, the London Company eagerly prepared for their proposed scheme of settlement. Sir Thomas Smith was elected treasurer, a gentleman who had amassed great wealth by merchandise, who was one of the assignees under Raleigh's patent, and was soon afterward made governor of the East India Company. Much has been said against him, but he was a man of public spirit and expanded views, and urged forward the enterprise with his influence and his contributions. The means of the company were at first very limited. 3 ships only were prepared, the largest of which was of not more than 100 tons burden, and Christopher Newport was selected for the command. He was a navigator of some renown, principally derived from a voyage of destruction against the Spaniards in 1592. But he was a vain and affected character, little calculated for decisive and manly action. Instructions were prepared, but the king, with his accustomed profundity of folly, directed that they should be sealed in a box and not opened until the voyagers arrived upon the coasts of Virginia. In the vessels there embarked, beyond the regular crews, 105 persons to form the settlement, and it does not seem extravagant to assert that Virginia has felt, through all her subsequent history, the influence of these first settlers in giving a peculiar bias to her population. Besides the 6 gentlemen intended for the council, and Mr. Robert Hunt, a minister of the gospel, we find the names of more than 50 cavaliers, who are carefully reckoned in the shipping list as gentlemen, and who were better fitted for the adventures of the drawing-room than for the rude scenes of the American forest. Disappointed in hope and reduced in fortune, these restless wanderers sought the New World with desire for exciting adventure and speedy wealth. Among them was George Percy, a member of a noble family and brother to the Earl of Northumberland. In this singular band we noted but 11 professed laborers, 4 carpenters, 1 blacksmith, 1 bricklayer, and 1 mason, But we are not surprised to find a barber to aid in making the toilette of the gentlemen, a tailor to decorate their persons, and a drummer to contribute to their martial aspirations. Thus prepared with the elements of a refined colony, Newport set sail from Blackwell, December 19, 1606. Adverse winds kept him long upon the coast of England, and with disappointment came discord and murmuring among the voyagers. The preacher suffered with weakening disease, but his soothing counsels alone preserved peace among this wild company. Instead of following Gosnold's former voyage immediately across the Atlantic, they sailed by the Canaries and West Indies, and while en full route, the dissensions among the great men raged so furiously that Captain John Smith was seized and committed to close confinement on the false charge that he intended to murder the council and make himself King of Virginia. Arriving at length near the coast of America, their false reckoning kept them in suspense so alarming that Ratcliffe, commander of one of the barks, was anxious to bear away again for England. But heaven, by its storms, contributed more to the settlements of Virginia than men by their infatuated counsels. 1607. A furious tempest drove them all night under bare poles, and on April 26th, they saw before them the broad inlet to the Bay of Chesapeake. The cape to the south they honored with the name of Henry, from the Prince of Wales, a noble youth whose character gave the fairest promise of a career of high-souled action, whose love to Raleigh was only succeeded by his father's hatred, and whose early death gave England cause for unaffected mourning. The northern headland was called Charles, from the king's second son, who afterward succeeded to his throne. As they passed the first cape, a desire for recreation possessed them, and 30, without arms, went on shore. But they were soon attacked by 5 savages, and 2 of the English were dangerously hurt. This inhospitable treatment promised but little for future peace. The sealed box was now opened, and it was found that Bartholomew Gosnold, John Smith, Edward Maria Wingfield, Christopher Newport, John Ratcliffe, John Martin, and George Kendall were named as members of the Provincial Council. Sailing leisurely up the beautiful expanse of water to which the Indians had given a name that Europeans have never violated, the voyagers were charmed with the prospect before them. The season was mild, and nature had fully assumed that emerald robe of spring. In either side, the distant land presented a scene of tranquil verdure, upon which the eye might rejoice to repose. The noble bay received into its bosom the waters of many broad streams, which descended from the highlands faintly visible in the dim horizon. Green islands saluted them at times as they advanced, and invited their approach by their peaceful loveliness. At length they reached the mouth of the magnificent river that tempted them too strongly to be resisted. This was the Powhatan of the Indians, and no true lover of Virginia can cease to deplore the change which robbed this graceful stream of a title pregnant with all the associations of Indian valor and of the departed glory of their empire, and bestowed a name that can only recall a royal pedant and a timid despot. 17 days were employed in searching for a spot suited to a settlement, May 13th. At length, they selected a peninsula on the north side of the river about 40 miles from its mouth, and immediately commenced the well-known city of Jamestown. A commendable industry seems at first to have prevailed. The council contrived a fort. The settlers felled the trees, pitched their tents, prepared gardens, made nets for the fish which abounded in the river, and already began to provide clapboards to freight the ships on their return to England. But these fair promises of good were destined to a speedy betrayal. Already discord prevailed in their councils, and a flagrant act of injustice had been committed, which soon recoiled upon the heads of its authors. We have heretofore mentioned the name of John Smith among the persons nominated for the council, and have spoken of violent imprisonment to which he was subjected during the outward voyage. Jealousy of his merit and commanding talents did not stop at this point. He was excluded from his place in the council, and an entry was made in their records detailing the alleged reason for this act. John Smith is the hero of the romantic destinies that attended the early life of Virginia, and the historian who would attempt to tell of her fortunes and yet neglect his story would be recreant to his trust. Nations have generally owed their brightest days of power or of happiness to the genius of a single person, directing their energies, subduing their follies, enlightening their seasons of early ignorance. Assyria has had her Semiramis, China her Confucius, Arabia her Mahomet, England her Alfred, and were we required to point to the man to whom America is principally indebted for the care of her infant years, we would not hesitate to name the heroic spirit who now appears before us. His talent for command excited the mean jealousy of inferior souls, only that his merit might appear brighter by contrast. If we have aught to urge against him, it is that he met the treachery of the Indians with a severe spirit, but too much akin to that of the Spaniards in the South. Yet we cannot reproach him with undeserved cruelty or with deliberate falsehood, and the stern demands of his circumstances often rendered inevitable acts which would otherwise have been ungrateful to his soul. When the council was constituted, Edward Maria Wingfield was elected president, a man who always proved an inveterate enemy to Smith and who speedily attracted the hatred of his accomplishments by his rapacity, his cowardice, and his selfish extravagance. Smith demanded a trial, but the council feared to trust their wretched charge to an impartial jury, and pretended, in mercy to him, to keep him under suspension. But their own incompetence soon brought his talents into demand. He accompanied Newport upon an exploring voyage up the river and ascended to the residence of King Powhatan, a few miles below the falls and not far from the spot now occupied by the city of Richmond. The royal seat consisted of 12 small houses, pleasantly placed on the north bank of the river and immediately in front of 3 verdant islets. His Indian Majesty received them with becoming hospitality, though his profound dissimulation corresponded but too well with the treacherous designs of his followers. He had long ruled with sovereign sway among the most powerful tribes of Virginia, who had been successively subdued by his arms, and he now regarded with distrust the event of men whom his experience taught him to fear and his injuries to detest. On their return to Jamestown, they found that, during their absence, the Indians had made an attack upon the settlement, had slain 1 boy, and wounded 17 men. The coward spirit of Wingfield had caused this disaster. Fearful of mutiny, he refused to permit the fort to be palisaded or guns to be mounted within. The assault of the savages might have been more fatal, but happily a gun from the ships carried a crossbar shot among the boughs of a tree above them, and shaking them down upon their heads, produced great consternation. The frightened wretches fled in dismay from an attack too mysterious to be solved, yet too terrible to be withstood. After this disaster, the fears of Wingfield were overruled. The fort was defended by palisades, and, armed with heavy ordnance, the men were exercised, and every precaution was used to guard against a sudden attack or a treacherous ambuscade. Smith had indignantly rejected every offer held out to him by the artifices of the council. He now again demanded a trial in a manner that could not be resisted. The examination took place and resulted in his full acquittal. So evident was the injustice of the president that he was adjudged to pay to the accused £200, which sum the generous Smith immediately devoted to the store of the colony. Thus elevated to his merited place in the council, He immediately devised and commenced active schemes for the welfare of the settlers, and on June 15th, Newport left the colony and set forth on his voyage of return to England. Left to their own resources, the colonists began to look with gloomy apprehension upon the prospect before them. While the ships remained, they enjoyed sea stores, which to them were real luxuries, but now they had little whereupon to feast, except a miserable compound of wheat and barley boiled with water, and even to the larger portion of this the worms successfully laid claim. Crabs and oysters were sought with indolent greediness, and this unwholesome fare, with the increasing heats of the season, produced sickness which preyed rapidly on their strength. The rank vegetation of the country pleased the eye, but it was fatal to the health. In 10 days, hardly 10 settlers were able to stand. Before the month of September, 50 of their number were committed to the grave, and among them we mark with sorrow the name of Bartholomew Gosnold. The gallant seaman might have passed many years upon the stormy coasts of the continent, but he sank among the first victims who risked their lives for colonization. To this scene of distress and appalling mortality, the President Wingfield lived in sumptuous indifference. His gluttony appropriated to itself the best provisions the colony could afford. Oatmeal, sack, oil, aquavitae, beef, eggs, or what not, and in this intemperate feasting it seemed as though his valueless life were only spared that he might endure the disgrace he so richly merited. Seeing the forlorn condition of the settlement, he attempted to seize the pinnace, which had been left for their use by Newport, and make his escape to England. These outrages so wrought upon the council that they instantly deposed him, expelled his accomplice, Kendall, and elected Ratcliffe to the presidency. Thus their body, consisting originally of 7, was reduced to 3. Newport had sailed, Gosnold was dead, Wingfield and Kendall were in disgraced seclusion. Martin, Ratcliffe, and Smith alone remained. They seem to have felt no desire to exercise their right of filling their vacant ranks. The first had a nominal superiority, but the genius of the last made him the very soul of the settlement. It is related by the best authority that in this dark crisis, when their counsels were distracted, their hopes nearly extinguished, their bodies enfeebled from famine and disease, the savages around them voluntarily brought in such quantities of venison, corn, and wholesome fruits that health and cheerfulness were at once restored. Their condition now brought them in almost daily contact with the aborigines. Ratcliffe and Martin were alike incompetent, and Smith assumed the guidance of affairs. Finding their provisions again nearly exhausted, he went with a party down the river to Kecoughtan to obtain supplies from the natives. Savage irony was all they received. A handful of corn and a piece of bread were offered in exchange for swords and muskets. The Indians came against them in numbers, frightfully dressed, and bearing their oki in the form of a monstrous idol stuffed with moss and hung with chains and copper. But they were received with a volley of pistol shot. The omnipotent oki fell to the earth, and with him several of his worshippers. The rest fled to the woods, and finding resistance vain, they brought quantities of corn, venison, turkeys, and wildfowl, and received in exchange beads, copper, hatchets, and their discomfited deity. During the absence of the ruling mind, Wingfield and Kendall seduced a few sailors and made another attempt to carry off the bark to England. At the critical moment, Smith returned, and instantly, directing the cannon of the fort against them, commanded submission. A skirmish ensued, and the seditious Kendall lost his life. A similar effort to the settlement was soon made by Captain Gabriel Archer and the imbecile President Ratcliffe, and again the decision of Smith arrested them and forced them to their duty. He was ever prompt, and hesitated not at any measures required to govern his turbulent compeers. And now the winter came on, and with it immense numbers of swan, geese, and ducks, which covered the rivers and afforded delightful food to the settlers. They daily feasted upon them and enjoyed in abundance the peas, pumpkins, persimmons, and other vegetable treasures which the season matured. But Smith could not be contented with a life of inactivity, however plentifully supplied. The council had ungratefully charged him with negligence in not searching for the head of the Chickahominy, and his own adventurous spirit urged him to renewed enterprise. He prepared his boat for a voyage, and in a season of uncommon rigor he set forth upon an expedition destined to add greatly to the fame of his already wonderful career. The Chickahominy falls into the James not many miles above the site of Jamestown. It flows through a very fertile region, and upon its banks were native settlements well supplied with the stores of savage labor. Up this stream Smith urged his boat with great perseverance, cutting through trunks of trees and matted underwood which opposed his progress. At length, finding the obstacles to increase, he left the boat in a broad bay, where Indian arrows could not reach her, and, strictly forbidding the crew to leave her, he pressed on, with 2 Englishmen and 2 Indians, eager to penetrate with their canoe the swamps beyond them. Hardly had he disappeared before the disobedient seamen left the boat and sought amusement upon the shore. Opechancanough, the Indian chief of great subtlety and courage, was near with a lurking band of savages, and instantly seizing his advantage, he made prisoner of George Casson, one of this party, and obtained from him full information as to the movements of Captain Smith. The cowardice of Casson did not save him. The savages put him to death with cruel tortures, and then pursued their more dreaded foe. Smith had now penetrated 20 miles into the marshes, and leaving the 2 Englishmen in the canoe, he went forward with an Indian guide. The savages found the 2 men sunk in stupid slumber by the side of the canoe, and shot them to death with arrows ere they could escape. But they had now to encounter a superior being. 200 savages approaching with fatal intent caused no dismay in the heart of Smith. Binding the Indian guide firmly to his arm, he used him as a shield to preserve him from the arrows of the enemy, and with his musket he brought 2 of them dead to the ground. He would perhaps have reached the canoe. The savages fell back appalled by his courage, but while in full retreat, he sunk to the middle in a swamp from which his utmost efforts could not extricate him. Excessive cold froze his limbs and deprived him of strength, yet the Indians dared not approach him until he threw away his arms and made signals of submission. Then they drew him out, and chafing his benumbed body, speedily restored him to activity. His self-possession was never lost for a moment. Discovering that Opechancanough was the chief, he presented to him a small magnetic dial, and made the simple savages wonder at the play of the needle beneath the glass surface. On this excursion he was made prisoner, and he himself assures us was saved by the Indian maiden Pocahontas. After a captivity of 7 weeks, he returned to Jamestown with increased knowledge of savage life and manners. He treated his Indian guides with great kindness, and gave them 2 heavy guns and a millstone for the monarch. But the present was too heavy for his strength, and when one of the cannons was discharged among the boughs of a tree, and crashing of wood and ice was heard, the timid natives declined any further interference with agents so formidable. The absence of Smith had caused disorder and insubordination in the colony. The pinnace had again been seized, and again he was obliged to level the guns of the fort against her and compel submission. He was now personally assailed by a charge replete with stupid malignity. Some, who believed themselves skilled in the Levitical law, accused him of being the cause of the death of Emery and Robinson, the 2 unfortunate men whom the Indians had slain, and with this pretext they clamored for capital punishment. To their insane charge, Smith replied by taking the accusers into custody, and by the first vessel he sent them for trial to England. By his courage, his address, and his firmness, he now wielded great influence with the Indians and proved the salvation of the settlement. End of section 35.
Section 36 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 10, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Founding of Quebec. Champlain establishes French power in Canada, A.D. 1608, by H. H. Miles. From the period of Cartier's and Roberval's expeditions, nearly 50 years elapsed before France renewed her efforts to colonize the New World. About the year 1598, the lucrative fur trade began to be encouraged by Henry IV of France, who, in the brief respite from religious wars, was turning his attention to colonization and commerce. In 1603, Samuel de Champlain, a French naval officer of high character and chivalrous instincts, made his first voyage to Canada in company with M. Pontgravé, a merchant of Saint-Malo, and together they pushed their way up the St. Lawrence as far as the rapids above Montreal, which Champlain named La Chine, à la Chine, for he thought that he had at last found a waterway to China. In 1608 he proceeded to found at Stadacona, Quebec, a fixed trading post of the merchant company, in whose service he had again come to the country. Champlain brought with him among the colonists a number of artisans who, on the magnificent headland of Quebec, erected a fort which was to become the refuge of the sadly menaced little European colony, and was long the center of French influence and dominion in the New World. The rivalries of various commercial companies and the conflicting colonial policy of France seriously retarded settlement and were a great vexation to Champlain. Moreover, his quarrels with the powerful Iroquois Indians, as here related by Dr. Miles, secretary of the Quebec Council of Instruction, long prevented the southward extension of French power in America. In 1627, Cardinal Richelieu, prime minister to Louis XIII, cancelled the old trading charters and established a company of 100 associates with power to trade throughout New France from Florida to Hudson Bay. By the terms of the charter, the 100 associates were given the sole right to engage in the fur trade, with control over the shore and inland fishing and of all commerce with the French settlements in the country. In return for this monopoly, the company agreed to carry out mechanics and tradesmen to the colony, to settle within a specified period some 6,000 colonists, and to make provision for the support of a certain number of Catholic clergy. The French king at the same time made Champlain governor, so that he finished his life in the service of the colony he had founded. Samuel de Champlain, who must be regarded as the real founder of the Canadian colony, when invited by de Chat or de Chast, commandant of Dieppe, to take part in the enterprise for colonizing New France. He had served in the French marine at the Antilles and also in the south of France against the Spaniards, and de Chat had met him at court. He was a man of noble and virtuous disposition, chivalrous, and inspired with a deep sense of religion, and at that time about 36 years of age. It will also be seen that Champlain was gifted with qualities which endeared him both to his own followers and to the native Indians of Canada. He was of good address, always able, when he desired it, to render himself acceptable to the highest personages in France, so as to secure a willing attention to his representations. Such was the man who, under the auspices of de Chatte and of M. de Monts, first made his appearance in New France, in whose early annals he figured conspicuously upward of 30 years. In 1603, Champlain, in conjunction with Pont Gravé, made his first voyage to the St. Lawrence. At Tadoussac, they left their ships and ascended the river in boats to the then farthest attainable point, the Sault St. Louis, now known as the Rapids, about the city of Montreal. The features of the country, so far as they could be examined from the river, were carefully observed. The Indian towns of Carrier's time, Stadacona and Hochelaga, were no longer in existence. But Champlain regarded with attention the scenery around their sites. Hochelaga is not even mentioned by him, although acting as Kerry had done nearly 70 years before, he ascended Mount Royal in order to obtain a good view. Returning to Tadoussac, where their 3 small vessels had been left, Champlain and Pont Gravé, towards autumn, set sail for France. De Chatte had died during their absence, and the company formed by him was already almost broken up. Champlain, however, prepared a narrative and a map to illustrate what he had seen, and submitted these for the information of Henry IV of France, who expressed his willingness to countenance the resumption of plans for settling the country. Almost immediately afterward, the company was reorganized by M. de Monts. He also was a Huguenot, patriotic, of great abilities and experience, and possessing much influence at court, without which he could not have surmounted impediments that were purposely raised against his designs from the first. The king, unmoved by the objections to de Monts, appointed him lieutenant general of the North American territory between 40 degrees and 46 degrees north latitude, with instructions to establish colonists, cultivate the soil, search for mines of gold and silver, build forts and towns, and with power to confer grants of land, as well as the exclusive right of trading with the natives in furs and all kinds of merchandise. Although a Protestant, while de Monts and his friends were to enjoy the free exercise of their religion, he was bound by the charter to provide for the conversion of the natives and their training exclusively in the principles and worship of the Church of Rome. The king was the more willing to grant the charter on these terms because de Monts and his company were to bear all the costs that might be incurred in their enterprise. Preparations were then made for the dispatch of an expedition on a larger scale than any that had yet left France for America. Early in the spring of 1604, de Monts set sail with 4 vessels, well manned and equipped with all means requisite both for carrying on the fur trade and for starting a colony at any place that might be judged suitable. He had under him Champlain and Pont Gravé, also a French nobleman named Poutrincourt, who was going out to settle with his family in America, and the subsequently celebrated historian Lescarbot. 2 of the ships were specially intended for the fur traffic, and in the first instance to scour the coasts and inlets for the purpose of driving away or capturing all persons found illegally trading with the natives. The other 2 ships had on board the intending colonists, among whom were soldiers and work people priests, ministers, and some gentlemen volunteers. The expedition did not steer for Canada, but for that part of New France then called Acadia, Nova Scotia, Dumont being under the impression that he should there find localities more favorable for settlement than by ascending the St. Lawrence. But it carried with it those whom Lescarbot justly styled the hope of Canada, for, besides Dumont, there were Champlain and Pontgravé, and probably many of inferior grade, whose participation in this attempt to found an Acadian colony must have greatly assisted in rendering their future services more valuable elsewhere. The effort at colonization in Acadia may be said to have been sustained under many vicissitudes during about 9 years until the year 1613. But long before this, the attention and services of Champlain and Pontgravé were withdrawn. Dumont lost his charter in 1606, about which time Champlain, having, in conjunction with Pontgravé, made a number of maritime excursions from Port Royal and some geographical discoveries during the previous 2 years, became urgent for the renewal of attempts up the river St. Lawrence, which he never ceased to represent as offering a more favorable field for enterprise than the shores of Acadia. In 1607, therefore, Dumont procured the restoration of his charter for the space of 1 year, and, following Champlain's suggestions, turned his attention to Canada. 2 vessels were fitted out and dispatched in April 1608. Arriving at Tadoussac in June, Champlain left his colleagues there to traffic with the natives, while he continued his route up the river, until he came to the place where Cartier and his companions had wintered in 1535. Champlain landed, and having ascended some distance from the mouth of the St. Charles towards the promontory now called Cape Diamond, judged the situation favorable for permanent settlement. Artisans, provisions, merchandise, arms, and tools were brought on shore, and a commencement made in the work of constructing wooden buildings and defenses. At the same time, preparations were made for cultivating the ground and for testing the productiveness of the soil by sowing various seeds brought from France. In these operations, begun on July 3, 1608, Champlain had in view the establishment of a fixed trading station for the advantage of the company he represented, as well as the more immediate purpose of providing for the security and accommodation of his people during the ensuing winter. But on the site of these rude works, the city of Quebec grew up in after times. Champlain is, therefore, entitled to be regarded as its founder, and the date last mentioned as that of its foundation. During the autumn the works were continued, Champlain himself superintending them with indefatigable activity. Pontgravé returned to France with the results of the season's traffic at Tadoussac. Champlain's experience, previously acquired at Port Royal, doubtless was of service in giving effect to his forethought and energy as regards preparations for the winter. For it is recorded that the 30 persons composing his party were comfortably protected from the ordinary rigors of the climate. On the return of spring, Champlain's activity of disposition did not suffer him to await the coming of Pontgravé from France. He set out at once up the St. Lawrence. Meeting parties of Indians belonging to Algonquin and Huron tribes, he entered into friendly communication with them. Between these tribes and the Iroquois, or Five Nations, a state of warfare subsisted. Champlain, on his part, desired to secure the friendship of those natives who were to be the more immediate neighbors of the French on the St. Lawrence, while the Algonquins and Hurons were equally solicitous about forming an alliance with the Europeans for the sake of aid against their enemies. An understanding was soon established. the Indians engaged to visit the French trading post with abundance of furs for the purpose of traffic, and promised to assist Champlain with facilities for exploring their country westward. On the other hand, Champlain undertook to help them in their conflicts with the Iroquois. In pursuance of this agreement, the French, under Champlain, first intervened in Indian warfare. Returning to Quebec, Champlain procured reinforcements and supplies for his establishment from Cavaet, who had by this time arrived at Tadoussac from France. Before the end of May, he set out again on his way up the river to join his Indian allies and to accompany them into the country of their enemies, the Iroquois. During the 27 years following the foundation of Quebec, the history of the colony consists almost exclusively of the personal history of Champlain, its founder, upon whose own memoirs we are dependent chiefly for authentic information. They present details of romantic incidents, of courage, fortitude, and virtue, of sagacity, and of indefatigable industry, of self-denial and patience, which will always entitle him to a high rank among the celebrated in the annals of mankind. In pursuance of the alliance he had entered into with the aborigines of Canada, as well as for the purpose of extending his discoveries, he engaged in 3 different warlike expeditions into the country of the Iroquois, viz., in the years 1609, 1611, and 1615. In his first expedition, he passed with a body of Algonquins and Montagnais up the river Richelieu, which then and subsequently was the principal route followed by the Iroquois when making incursions into Canada. He discovered that this river formed the outlet of the waters of a beautiful lake, which he was the first of Europeans to behold, and which he called Lake Champlain, after his own name. He was now in parts frequented by the Iroquois. According to Champlain's description, it was a region abounding in game, fish, beavers, bears, and other wild animals. Not far from the site upon which long afterward Fort Ticonderoga was constructed, the invaders fell in with a body of 200 Iroquois, who were easily beaten and put to flight, chiefly owing to the chivalrous valor of Champlain and the terror inspired by firearms used by him and his 2 attendant Frenchmen. Here Champlain witnessed for the first time the cruelties and horrors attendant upon Indian warfare, and he appears to have exerted his utmost influence vainly in endeavoring to save the wounded and captive Iroquois from being tortured. To his indignant remonstrances, the conquerors turned a deaf ear, alleging that they were only inflicting upon their enemies the sufferings which their own people had often endured at their hands, and which were reserved for themselves should they ever fall into the power of the Iroquois. After this, the allies made their way back to the St. Lawrence, when the Hurons and Algonquins returned to their settlements toward the Ottawa region, while Champlain and the Montagnais descended the river to Quebec. The battle with the Iroquois took place on July 30th, 1609, so that upward of 2.5 months had been occupied in the campaign. In September following, Champlain set sail for France, accompanied by Cavaet. Before he left Quebec, he made all the arrangements in his power for the safety of those left to winter there. A trustworthy commander was appointed, and in order to prevent the necessity of outdoor labor during the time of severe cold, a supply of fuel was provided in the autumn. For it was supposed that exposure and hard work combined were among the causes of the terrible malady which had afflicted Champlain's people in the winter of 1608. On his arrival in France, he reported his adventures and the condition of New France to the king, by whom he was treated with the utmost consideration and kindness. Nevertheless, owing to opposition and clamor, it was found impossible to bring about the renewal of the charter which had expired. In spite of this, Dumont succeeded in procuring the means of fitting out 2 vessels in the spring of 1610, in which Champlain and Pont-Gravé set sail from Harfleur about the middle of April and arrived at Tadoussac on May 26. At Quebec, Champlain found his people in good health and undiminished numbers, the winter having been passed through without the endurance of any particular hardship. His Indian allies, also the Hurons, Algonquins, and Montagnais, were eagerly waiting for him to rejoin them in another attack upon the Iroquois. In the middle of June, Champlain, with a few Frenchmen, left Quebec and proceeded up the St. Lawrence to the mouth of the river Richelieu. Near to this, on ascending that river and employing the services of scouts, it was found that a body of Iroquois had established themselves in a post fortified by means of great trees which had been felled, so that their branches, interlaced with each other, presented a strong wall of defense. The Algonquins and Montagnais immediately commenced an attack, when, although assisted by the French with their arquebuses, it was for a long time found impossible to force an entrance into position. In the end, however, the Iroquois fled, leaving 15 of their number prisoners. The conquerors had 3 killed and about 50 wounded, among whom was Champlain himself. Again was he compelled to witness the perpetration of the most revolting cruelties upon the unfortunate Iroquois captured by his allies, whom he could not restrain, although now regarded by them with feelings amounting to veneration. Champlain was now in a position to do something toward forwarding his own plans through the goodwill and assistance of the Hurons and Algonquins. To extend the knowledge of the country westward and to find out a passage through the continent to China were to him as much objects of desire as they had been to Cartier before him. The Indian chiefs promised to furnish all the facilities he required, and they placed in his care a young Huron whom he afterward took to Paris. At the same time, a young Frenchman was entrusted to a chief named Iroquet for the purpose of learning the Algonquin language and of visiting the lakes, rivers, and mines which were stated to exist in the interior of the country. When these arrangements had been made, Champlain and his allies parted. On arriving at Quebec, he learned the sad intelligence of the death of his powerful friend and patron, King Henry IV, who had been assassinated 3 months before in the streets of Paris. Although the season was not far advanced, he immediately took his departure for France, accompanied by Pont-Gravé. In the spring of 1611, Champlain returned to Canada. During the winter, although it was now impossible to recover the exclusive privileges which had formerly been accorded to his company, he and Pont-Gravé had again succeeded in procuring the means of equipping several vessels. Dumont still enjoyed the title of Lieutenant General of New France, but was greatly crippled in his resources and influence in consequence of the king's death and the large expenses attendant on previous undertakings in connection with the establishments in Acadia, at Tadoussac, and Quebec. But the most discouraging circumstance, which now cut off all hope of redeeming his losses, was the virtual throwing open of the peltry trade in the St. Lawrence, of which the traders belonging to French maritime ports availed themselves in considerable numbers. For when Champlain and Pont-Gravé arrived out at Tadoussac, towards the end of May, they found traders already there doing business with the savages, and that others had preceded them in the river above as far as the rapids near Hochelaga. Champlain hastened to the latter place, with the determination of establishing there a trading station for the benefit of the company. Temporary structures were begun near the site of the future city of Montreal, Ground was cleared and seeds sown in order to test the fruitfulness of the soil. He proposed to erect a fort on an island, called by him St. Helens, after the name of his wife. Champlain went to France before winter, and was there detained nearly 2 years by the affairs of the company. Although his zeal and his hopes of founding a colony never flagged, even de Monts retired from participation in further undertakings owing to the uncertainties attendant upon the peltry traffic and the losses incurred. It appears that Champlain deemed it indispensably necessary for the colony and for the trading company with which it might be connected to possess as chief some personage in France who had influence and rank at court. Therefore, on the retirement of de Monts, the Count of Soissons was applied to, and afterward the Prince Henri de Condé. Condé being created Viceroy of New France, Champlain was appointed his lieutenant. Much time was then occupied in negotiations, with the object of effecting a compromise with the merchants and traders of Dieppe, Saint-Malo, Rochelle, and Rouen. In the end, some kind of arrangement was made, securing for the wants of the colony at Quebec a certain portion of the results of the fur trade to be paid by traders, but it seems that no perfectly satisfactory arrangement was practicable at that time, owing to the state of affairs at the court of France, which would not renew the former exclusive privileges. Early in May 1613, Champlain arrived at Quebec. The people whom he had left there in 1611 had passed the 2 preceding winters without any notable occurrence and free from suffering or disease. After a short delay, he proceeded up the river to Sault St. Louis, at the foot of the rapids, where he expected to find many of his former Indian friends assembled in readiness for traffic. In fact, his mind was now intent upon a long journey of exploration westward, in company with some returning chiefs. But this season few Indians came, which Champlain attributed to misconduct on the part of the traders the previous year while he was absent in France. Taking with him 2 canoes, manned by 4 Frenchmen and an Indian guide, he contrived to pass the rapids and to surmount all the other difficulties of a first passage up the river Ottawa, until he arrived at Île Allumette, where resided a friendly chief named Tessoua, who received him with cordial hospitality and celebrated his unexpected visit by giving a grand entertainment. Champlain requested canoes and people to conduct him and his attendants on the way to Lake Nipissing, whence, according to information of Nicolas Duvigneau, who had passed the previous winter with Tessoua, there was a practicable route to North Sea, from which it was believed the coveted passage to China would be found. Champlain's hopes rose with this information, but before he could act upon it, Duvigneau was proved to be an impostor. Champlain, therefore, with reluctance, sorrowfully commenced his journey homeward to Quebec, whence, toward the latter part of August, he again sailed for France, in order to promote the interests of the colony, so much dependent on the course of events in the mother country. In April 1615, Champlain sailed from Harfleur with several vessels having on board supplies for the colony, artisans and laborers, together with 4 persons of the religious order of Franciscans, called Récollets. The latter took out with them the appliances and ornaments that might be required for the use of portable chapels and places of worship in the wilderness, and which had been provided at the cost of religious persons in France. Immediately on his arrival in Canada, about the beginning of June, he took steps for establishing regular religious services at the 3 principal trading posts, Quebec, 3 Rivers, and Tadoussac, at the first of which places a sort of council was held, consisting of himself, the 4 Récollets, and, quote, the most intelligent persons in the colony, end quote. The arrangements agreed upon comprised in addition to dispositions of a permanent nature at the 3 principal localities named above, the sending forward one of the Récollets, Joseph Le Caron, into the distant regions occupied by the Huron tribes, which up to this time had not been visited by any European. Thus, under Champlain's auspices, were the first foundations laid for establishing in Canada the faith and services of the Church of Rome, and especially, in the first instance, for commencing the, quote, missions to the Indians, end quote, which have survived the vicissitudes of more than 2 centuries and subsist to this day in forms and localities regulated by the progress of civilization on this continent. During the winter of 1618, the colony was reduced to the verge of extinction through the defection of its fickle allies, the Indians. The station at 3 Rivers had become to them a great place of resort, and while many hundreds of savages were assembled there, a quarrel occurred at Quebec between some Indians and colonists, the particulars of which have not been very clearly transmitted. But the result was similar to that which had been experienced in the time of Jacques Cartier, for the Indians became discontented and hostile, manifesting a disposition to take advantage of the helplessness of the handful of Europeans established in their midst. 2 Frenchmen were murdered, and this outrage was followed by a conspiracy which was entered into by the Indians at 3 Rivers, with the object of consummating the destruction of the entire colony. The Récollet brother Duplessis discovered the plot, and while the French at Quebec remained closely shut up in their fort, contrived to disconcert it. In the end, the savages, who seem to have had originally no very serious cause of offense, proposed a reconciliation, which was acceded to by the French, on the condition that the case of the murderers should be decided on Champlain's return, and that in the meantime hostages should be given. Champlain's absence continued for the space of about 3 years, as he did not return to Quebec until July 1620. By this time the course of events had taken a favorable turn. The Viceroy Condé regained his liberty, and, in consideration of a sum of money, surrendered his viceroyalty in favor of the Duke of Montmorency, a godson of the late king. Montmorency confirmed Champlain in his post of lieutenant-general, and the king himself, Louis XIII, favored him with royal letters expressing his recognition of the appointment and of his services. Thus fortified and charged by the new viceroy to return to Quebec and improve the defenses of the colony, Champlain induced a number of persons to embark with him for the purpose of settling in the country. He himself arranged all his private affairs and took out with him his wife and several relations. The return of Champlain, accompanied by Madame Champlain, then only 22 years of age, was celebrated at Quebec with all the manifestations of rejoicing and of respect that it was possible for the people to evince. It was an epoch in the history of the colony. The Indian savages were especially delighted with the amiable demeanor and the beauty of Madame Champlain, who at once set about learning their language and in many ways testified her concern in their welfare. She soon became able to instruct their children using their native tongue in the principles of the Catholic religion, for, though formerly a Huguenot, she was now a devout adherent of the church to which her husband belonged. Champlain found the edifices at Quebec in a dilapidated condition, so that his first care was to effect repairs on the magazine, the old fort, and other buildings, as well as to provide temporary quarters for his family. Steps were also taken for commencing a structure extensive enough to afford protection to all the inhabitants and the interests of the company in case of serious attack from any enemy, and so situated as to command the harbor. The site chosen was that now known as Durham Terrace, where subsequently, when Champlain's design was practically carried out, the famous Fort St. Louis stood, the residence and official headquarters of many governors of Canada. Champlain might have now enjoyed a period of comparative repose, but for two causes of anxiety which soon pressed themselves upon his attention. The first of these was his knowledge of the cruel state of war subsisting between the Iroquois and the natives of Canada. In 1620, the former made excursions in considerable force, and although few or none of them at that time approached Quebec, they pressed hard upon the Algonquins higher up the river, and lay in wait for his former allies, the Hurons, whom they slaughtered without mercy as they descended with the products of the chase for the purpose of trading with the French at Three Rivers, Quebec, and Tadoussac. The injury to French interests, apart from the necessity for being always on the alert to defend themselves in case of attack from these barbarians, may be imagined. Champlain, as the only recourse open to him, made appeals to the Company and to the court of France for succor. In the course of 1622 and the following year, several additional priests and brothers of the Order of Récollets came out to Canada, among whom was Gabriel Sagard, the historian, who, along with Le Caron, departed as missionaries into the Huron settlements beyond Lake Simcoe. These two priests rendered most valuable services to the colony, in becoming the influential promoters of peace with the Iroquois in 1624. They had labored to confirm in the minds of the Huron people a disposition to come to terms with their fierce adversaries, between whom and themselves unceasing hostilities had been waged ever since the period of Champlain's third and unsuccessful expedition against the Cantons. The war had proved harassing to all parties concerned, the French, the Iroquois, the Hurons, the Algonquins, and minor tribes, and all were more or less inclined to accede to proposals for a general cessation of strife. Caron and Sagard accompanied a flotilla of 60 Huron canoes down the Ottawa and St. Lawrence to Three Rivers, at which place, in the presence of Champlain, it was intended to agree upon and ratify a general treaty. On the way to this rendezvous, they were joined by 25 canoes bearing the Iroquois deputies and 13 of the Algonquins. The preliminaries having been arranged, happily without the occurrence of quarrels so likely to take place in such a concourse of individuals belonging to different nations, the ceremonies and customary distribution of presents were followed by a mutual interchange of stipulations, rendered intelligible to all by means of interpreters. The final result was a treaty of peace, to which the chief contracting parties were the French, the Hurons, the Algonquins, and the Iroquois, who agreed thenceforward to remain on peaceable terms with each other. The peace thus established was not of long duration. In the meantime, the improvements projected by Champlain in 1620 were steadily prosecuted. Very extensive repairs and additions to former structures and a number of new ones were completed or in progress. The de Caen and the governor, notwithstanding the difference in their religious views, continued throughout to discharge their respective functions in a manner that denoted mutual respect and personal friendship. Yet, from whatever cause, the number of inhabitants, exclusive of a few factors or agents at the trading posts, and the Frenchmen who from choice had taken up their abodes among the Indian tribes, remained less than 60. In fact, every person who bestowed a transient thought upon Canada placed a very low estimate upon it as a country fit for settlement, excepting Champlain himself, whose faith in the future of his colony seems never to have wavered. In August 1624, Champlain made arrangements for revisiting France, where fresh dissensions had arisen in regard to the company's rights and privileges. His chief purpose was to again urge at home an appeal for a more generous support in behalf of his undertakings. The Récollets, also having found themselves utterly unequal to the occupation of their immense and constantly increasing field of missionary work, had determined to appeal for aid to some of the religious communities of France, and, with this view, deputed Sagard and a priest to sail for Europe in the suite of the governor. Before his departure, Champlain nominated the younger de Caen commandant at Quebec during his absence, and gave instructions that the works in progress should be prosecuted with the utmost vigor, especially the completion of the Fort St. Louis. These preparations being made, he set sail on August 15, 1624, accompanied by his wife and the 2 Récollet deputies. Champlain, having accomplished all that seemed at that time attainable in France, returned to Quebec in the summer of 1626, accompanied by the priest Le Caron and his brother-in-law Boulet as his lieutenant. He found the works scarcely advanced beyond the condition in which he had left them 2 years before. His people also were in a somewhat enfeebled condition. They had been ill supplied with necessaries the preceding season, owing to the neglect of the company to furnish what was requisite for their comfort and plentiful support during the winter of 1625. Notwithstanding the exertions which had been made by Champlain to prevent a recurrence of the former sufferings of the colony owing to the neglect of the company, he and his people were doomed to struggle on precisely as heretofore. Scarcely any land had been cleared, so that it was impossible by means of agriculture alone to provide against famine in the winter. Nevertheless, the requisite supplies were furnished by the company's agents in the most niggardly manner. Its neglect became worse and worse, until in the winter of 1626 there was an actual dearth of provisions at Quebec. In the spring of 1627, de Caen's vessels brought out, as usual, a certain supply of necessaries. But when the summer had passed away and autumn came, although the season of traffic had been very profitable, the ships departed, leaving the establishments in the colony very insufficiently provisioned. The colony contained but one farmer, Louis Herbert, who could maintain himself and those dependent on him by the cultivation of the ground. But about 50 persons had to endure the rigors of the winter of 1627 on short allowance, and such became their plight that even Champlain's patience and powers of endurance were severely exercised. When at length the arrival of spring afforded some sources of relief, derived from hunting and fishing, Champlain and his unfortunate colonists at Quebec were amazed to find that de Caen's ships came not as usual with succors. With infinite anxiety they contrived to subsist until the month of July, when it became known that the river below the island of Orleans was in possession of the English, at that time enemies to France. In fact, on July 10, 1628, then at Tadoussac with several ships under his command, to surrender the fort and station of Quebec. Notwithstanding his weakness, which would have prevented him from offering any effectual resistance had Kirke followed up his summons by an attack upon the place, Champlain responded with dignity and firmness, declaring that he would defend his post. Kirke, therefore, for the present, deferred his hostile intentions upon Quebec, and contented himself with adopting measures to intercept supplies and succor from France. Cut off from communication with France, Champlain exhorted his now isolated band of priests, colonists, and laborers to follow his own example of patience and courage. A single small ship, with very scanty supplies, succeeded in making its passage good through the English vessels to Quebec, with intelligence that at least 10 months must elapse before adequate succor from France could be expected to reach the harbor. to cope with the present emergency, and to prevent absolute starvation, measures were taken to crop all the cleared ground in the neighborhood. At the same time, recourse was had to hunting and fishing for the purpose of collecting food for the ensuing winter, and Champlain's brother-in-law, Eustache Boulet, was dispatched with a small vessel and 12 men down to Gaspé in the hope of falling in with the French fishing vessels and procuring intelligence and assistance. Some steps were also taken for the obtaining aid from the Abnaquis. These responded favorably, promising to furnish maintenance sufficient for about 3/5 of Champlain's people until succor should arrive. The other Indians, however, the Montagnais and Algonquins, took advantage of the emergency and manifested, both in demeanor and hostile acts, their enmity to the French. Having contrived to sustain a precarious existence up to the middle of July 1629, the French witnessed, instead of the expected fleet from France, the English, under Louis and Thomas Kirke, brothers of Sir David, who remained at Tadoussac, making their appearance off Point-Levis. Provisions were very scarce, as well as ammunition and all other means of defense, and there seemed to be no prospect of immediate succor. He had with him only 16 persons who could in any sense be styled combatants. An officer landed, bringing with him very liberal terms, upon which Champlain and his followers might honorably surrender a post which in their circumstances was utterly untenable. Champlain and Pont-Gravé, who was present, acceded, and the conditions having been ratified by Sir David Kirke at Tadoussac, the English, without resistance, took possession of the fort, magazine, and habitations of Quebec. Before actually yielding up his post, the high-minded Champlain went on board the vessel of Captain Louis Kirke, and stipulated for the security of the place of worship and quarters of the Jesuits and Récollets, as well as for the protection of the property of the widow Herbert and her son-in-law Couillard. On July 24, 1629, Champlain and the priests, together with all who chose to depart, embarked on board the vessel of Thomas Kirke, and after some delay at Tadoussac were carried to England, and thence suffered to pass into France. Thus ended, for the time, Champlain's effort to found and establish a colony at Quebec, an attempt persevered in during 20 years, in spite of discouragement and obstacles which would have conquered the zeal of any man of that age excepting Champlain, who alone, even now, when taken prisoner and carried out of the country, did not despair of ultimate success. Cardinal Richelieu, the Prime Minister of Louis XIII, founded the society called the Company of the 100 Associates. It was established not merely to put an end to the various obstacles and evils under which the colony languished, but also to place its future upon a strong and durable basis. Its organization was completed in the year 1627, and the first expedition under its auspices were entered upon in 1628, but proved an entire failure, owing to the English having then the control of the St. Lawrence, and capturing or destroying the vessels sent out under M. de Roquemont. Then occurred, as we have described, the surrender of Quebec and the other stations, and their occupation by the English under the Kirkes. The existence of the new company and its government of the affairs of the colony can scarcely be said to have commenced practically until the year 1632, when New France was, by treaty with England, restored to the French authorities. Pursuant to arrangements, Emery de Caen, furnished with instructions from the government of France, and with an order signed by the King of England, superseded Thomas Kirke at Quebec on July 13, 1632. On landing with the priests who were sent out on board de Caillon's vessels, it was found that much injury had been done in the place. Fire, violence, and wilful neglect had been instrumental in destroying nearly all the buildings, including those of the Jesuits and Récollets. It was also found that the old friends of the French, the Montagnais, and other Indians, had been much corrupted by the traders, with whom they had held intercourse during the 3 preceding years. The fort itself remained uninjured and afforded shelter to all, while the work of reconstructing habitations and a place of worship were carried on. In the meantime, Champlain made preparations in France for carrying out colonists' merchandise, ammunition, and provisions. The company furnished him with 3 vessels, well equipped and armed with cannon. With these, having on board about 200 persons, he arrived at Quebec on May 23, 1633, and landed amid manifestations of great joy on the part of the French inhabitants, more especially of those who had remained in the country after his forced departure. From the moment of his return to Canada until his decease, Champlain occupied himself diligently in providing for the material progress of the colony, and at the same time cooperated heartily in all measures for securing its religious welfare and for converting the savages. While occupied with various duties appertaining to his position, about October 10, 1635, Champlain was laid prostrate by a stroke of paralysis. In his last illness, he was attended by his friend and spiritual adviser, Charles Lalemant, the author of the Relation of 1626, and, during the previous 10 years, a most efficient coadjutor in his work. At length, on Christmas Day, 1635, the pious and amiable founder of Quebec breathed his last, bequeathing his blessing to his bereaved people, together with the memory of his virtues and of his great services. End of section 36. End of the Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 10, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd.